The Earl of Cressbourne did not shout. He never did. That was the thing about Calder Rentham. His cruelty was quiet, measured, the kind that left no fingerprints. He stood at the center of Greyvale's great hall with a letter in one hand and what he'd found in the attic in the other. And he looked at her the way a man looks at a forged banknote. Not angry, exactly. Just done. 5 months, he said. You have lived in this house for 5 months. You have eaten my food and slept under my roof and accepted wages from my steward. He paused. And your name is not Marsh. 12 of them lined the walls. Mrs. Tully, the housekeeper, cook, the footman, the 2 girls from the scullery who were barely 16 and had no idea what they were watching. Orla counted them without meaning to. 12. She did not speak. Orla Standish, said the Earl. He said it the way you say a thing that tastes bad. That is your name, is it not? It wasn't a question. It is, she said. And Standish, he went on, his voice still level, still terribly quiet, is the name on every mortgage document in this house, every deed, every note held against this estate. He dropped the letter to his side. You came here under a false name. You have been sleeping in my house and going through my papers. Do not deny it. I know you have. And you never once saw fit to tell me who you are. She had no answer that would sound like anything but guilt. The answer existed. It was true, and it was reasonable, and it would take 20 minutes to explain properly. And she was standing in front of 12 people in a house that should have been hers. And she had about 30 seconds before her voice started shaking. So she said nothing. The Earl reached into his coat pocket. He took out a small oval locket on a broken chain, tarnished silver, the clasp worn smooth, and he crossed the floor and set it on the table in front of her, not in her hand. On the table, like a tip left for a servant. Your grandfather's house was cleared out in 1809, he said. This was found in the attic last autumn. I've had no use for it. Take it. Buy yourself supper. He walked out. No one in that hall moved. Orla stood still for a moment, because she understood that if she moved too quickly she would break. And she had made herself a promise a long time ago about not breaking in front of an audience. She picked up the locket. She put it in her pocket. She turned and walked the length of that hall with her chin up and her hands perfectly steady, and she did not look at any of them. She heard Mrs. Tully say her name once, quietly, behind her. She did not stop. Her room was on the 3rd floor at the back of the house. The seamstress's room, small and cold, with a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. She had lived in it for 5 months and 3 days. She got the door shut behind her. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Then she opened the locket. She had expected nothing. A lock of hair, perhaps. An empty frame. The kind of thing that winds up in attics because nobody thought to throw it away and nobody thought to keep it. What she found was a miniature portrait, painted on ivory, no larger than her thumbnail. An old man with heavy brows and a jaw like a blade, a particular way of holding his mouth, not quite a frown, not quite a smile. The expression of a man who has seen a great many things and has formed his opinions accordingly. Orla had seen that face once. She had been 9 years old, standing on a wet street corner in Bristol with her father's hand tight around hers, watching a black carriage roll past. Her father had pulled her back into a doorway and waited until the sound of hooves faded before he spoke. "That's your grandfather," he had said. "He doesn't know you exist. He doesn't want to." She sat in the seamstress's room at Greyvale Hall for a long time with the locket in her palm. Her surname was Standish. She had never thought much of it beyond that. Standish was a common enough name in the West Country. But her grandfather had not been common at all. Bartholomew Standish had started with a single apothecary's shop in Bristol and had died, by all accounts, the owner of 8 properties, a pharmaceutical house with offices in 3 counties and more notes and mortgages than any private man had a right to hold. His name was on the deed of Greyvale Hall itself. It was on the deed of every farm within 6 miles of it. It was on the mortgage that the Earl of Cressbourne had been paying, or failing to pay, for 11 years. She had known this when she came. That was the reason she had come. She had not come to steal. She had come to find a single piece of paper, a codicil to her grandfather's original conveyance of the estate, witnessed by 2 solicitors and filed in 1808, which her father's agent had sworn was lost. Orla did not believe it was lost. She believed it was hidden, and she believed that what it said would change everything she had been told about who had the right to be in this house. But she had not found it, and now she was sitting in the seamstress's room with nothing but a locket and the Earl's contempt, and the door downstairs had been very clearly indicated. She was not afraid of being thrown out. She had lived in worse places than a draughty hall. What made her hands shake, sitting there on the edge of the bed, was the thought that the face in the locket meant the answer she'd been looking for had been up in that attic the whole time, 50 feet above her head, in a box no one had thought to open. She didn't tell anyone about the locket. That was the first decision, and she made it before she stood up. She made it because if she walked downstairs and said, "That locket is my grandfather's, and the man whose face is in it held the deed to this hall," the Earl would look at her with that cold, careful face and say, "Then write to his solicitors and sort it out yourself." And she would have to explain that she couldn't, that Standish and Sons had passed to a cousin she had never met, that the letters she'd written in 3 years had been answered with polite, impenetrable silence, that she had come here with £40 and a false name because it was the only option left to her. She would rather carry it quietly. The village of Cressbourne had 2 streets, a mill, a church, with a bell that didn't ring properly, and a draper's shop belonging to a widow named Mrs. Rook, who mended things for £1 a length. Orla walked into it on a Thursday morning with her mother's sewing basket on her arm and asked for work. Mrs. Rook looked her over for a long moment. She was a sharp-faced woman of 55 who had the particular quality of people who have run a shop alone for a decade. She missed nothing and said approximately half of what she observed. "You're the one from the hall," she said. "The seamstress they threw out." "I am." "Can you sew?" "I can." "Sit down there," said Mrs. Rook, "and do that hem. If your stitches are bad, I'll say so." The stitches were not bad. Orla had learned to sew in a house with no servants, and a mother whose eyesight had given out before Orla was 12. She sewed now with her head down and her needle moving steadily, and she did not look up until it was finished. Mrs. Rook turned it to the light. She ran her thumb along the seam. She set it down. "1 a length," she said, "and you sit in the back. I'm not running a traveling show." The whole village came to look anyway. By the 2nd week, Orla had been offered a cold pasty by the blacksmith's wife, helped over a muddy stretch of road by a farmer who said nothing and touched his hat when they reached dry ground, and asked by the schoolmaster, a nervous young man named Mr. Headley who wore the same coat 5 days running, whether she could possibly spare 2 mornings a week for his older pupils. He had 17 children who needed to know how to do sums and write a proper letter, and he could not pay anything at all, and he was sorry for asking. "Tuesdays and Thursdays," said Orla, "after the shop, 3 o'clock." She was happier than she had been in years. She turned it over on the walk home every evening, and it did not make sense, and she stopped trying to make sense of it. She had a stool in the back of a draper's shop and 17 children who called her Miss, and she had started keeping the money in a tin on the windowsill of the room she was renting from Mrs. Rook's sister, and by the 3rd week There was 4 shillings in it. She had spent 3 years being told she had nothing and was owed nothing. 4 shillings she had made herself was the most real money she had ever held. And in the village, she learned things. She learned them the way you learn things in a small place. Slowly, sideways, without meaning to. She learned that the East Farms had been sold in all but name, and that the tenants paid their rent to an agent from Bristol who came twice a year. She learned that the mill wheel had been cracked since February, and nothing had been done. She learned that a family named Marsh had applied to the hall for roof repairs in January and been told there was no money, and that 2 of their children had spent the winter sick in a damp bedroom. And she learned from 3 separate people in as many weeks, always in the same lowered voice, the name of the house in Bristol that held every stone of Greyvale in its accounts. Standish and Sons. She said nothing. She sewed and taught and listened, and at night she lay awake and built the shape of it in her head. Her grandfather's money had paid the wages of the servants who had watched her walk out of that hall. Her grandfather's money had not fixed the Marsh family's roof. She had stopped feeling ashamed somewhere around the 2nd week. What she felt now was steadier and colder and much more useful. The Earl came through the village on a Friday afternoon in late October. He had ridden out to the south field and was cutting back through Cressbourne because the main road was flooded. He pulled his horse up short at the churchyard gate. There was a young woman in the yard with 7 children around her, and one small boy reading off a slate with the particular concentration of someone for whom the words are still separate, difficult things. Her head was bent towards him, listening. When the boy reached the end of the line and looked up, she said something Calder couldn't hear, and the boy's whole face changed, opened like a window in spring, and she laughed, a real laugh, delighted and without reserve. Calder Rentham sat on his horse and watched his former seamstress crouch down in the mud of the churchyard in her good gray dress and talk to a child who had just learned how to read. He had a very precise idea of what Orla Standish was: a liar, an interloper, a woman who had come into his house under false pretenses with an agenda he still didn't fully understand. He had told himself this 17 times in the 5 weeks since he'd shown her the door. He had never once in 5 months seen her laugh. Something settled under his ribs then, wrong-shaped and heavy, and it was still there when she straightened up, and she was still there when she straightened and turned, and found him watching her. She did not curtsy. She stood in the churchyard with a piece of chalk in her hand and looked at him directly, and he found, to his own considerable irritation, that he was the one who had to speak first. "You're teaching," he said. "I am." Without being asked. "Mr. Headley asked," said Orla. "You told me to find work. Would you like me to stop?" There it was, that particular moment. He opened his mouth to say yes. He was aware of it, the word forming, and then he didn't say it. He looked away up the road with his jaw set hard. "No," he said. He turned the horse and rode back up the hill. She was at Mrs. Rook's shop the following Wednesday, when the widow spread the Bristol paper on the counter and put her finger on a paragraph without looking up. "Something in here about that house," she said. "Standish and Sons. My cousin writes she's not sleeping well with her savings there, now the old man's gone." Orla stopped. "Gone?" "Died." Mrs. Rook turned the page around. 7 weeks ago, at his desk, 74 years old. Orla crossed the shop. She had to hold the edge of the counter. The paragraph was 4 lines. Died on the 9th of September at his offices in Bristol. Bartholomew Standish, Esquire, founder of the pharmaceutical house of Standish and Sons. He was in his 75th year. He is survived by no issue. The disposition of his considerable estate will be read at Bristol on the 12th of December. Survived by no issue. Orla read it 3 times. 7 weeks. He had been dead for 7 weeks. He had died at his desk on the 9th of September. And on the 9th of September, she had been in the draper's back room hemming curtains for $1 a length. And nobody had told her. And there was no reason on earth why anyone should have. She had spent 5 months deciding with great firmness that she would never ask that man for anything as long as she lived. She had not considered that the door might close from the other side first. She was out in the street before she knew she'd moved, walking in the dark up the road with her hand pressed flat against her mouth so that no one in Cressbourne would hear the sound she was making. The letter that Simeon Loach had written 3 weeks earlier, on the day he'd gone into Orla's room to look through her things, had gone to Bristol, to the offices of Standish & Sons, addressed to the managing partner. It was a very careful letter, because Loach was a very careful man. It asked, under the pretense of administrative tidiness, for confirmation of the guarantor on the Greyvale estate accounts. It was not really a question about accounts. It was a man pressing his hand against a wall to feel for the shape of a door. The reply came back 10 days later. The sum paid quarterly to the Greyvale estate had been drawn from Bartholomew Standish's private account. 3 payments had been made. Copies of the receipts were enclosed. The receipts bore Simeon Loach's signature. Loach read the letter twice. Then he sat at his desk and didn't move for some time. He had been at Greyvale Hall for 12 years. 12 years of quarterly payments arriving from Bristol. 12 years of signing for them. 12 years of entering a lesser figure in the estate books and pocketing the difference. The Earl signed what was put in front of him. He always had. It was one of the few reliable things about the man. Loach was not hasty. He had 12 years of patience to draw on. He went up to Orla's empty room on a Sunday afternoon and went through what remained with methodical care. He found the locket on the windowsill. He found her letters in the writing case. 3 years of correspondence to Standish & Sons, all unanswered. He did not find what she'd come looking for. She had been cleverer than that. What he did find was enough. He took the household silver from the dining room sideboard. A set of 6 spoons and a creamer, small enough to go unnoticed for a week, and he put them wrapped in a cloth at the bottom of the bag she'd left behind. On her writing table, he placed a half-written letter to an address in Bristol, in a hand that was not quite hers but close enough. That said, "I have found the conveyance document. I can have it to you by month's end if you can confirm." He left it unfinished. Unfinished letters, he had found, were always more convincing than finished ones. Then he went downstairs and told Mrs. Tully, with deep regret, that he believed someone had been through the silver. They found the bag at 8:30 that evening. The Earl came down the main staircase with the half-written letter in his hand, and 12 servants standing along the hall wall, because Loach had felt it best that the search be conducted openly. The same hall, the same 12 people. Orla had been brought back from the village by a footman, and she stood in the center of the floor and understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, exactly what had happened, and exactly why she could not prove it. "Tell me this is not your hand," said the Earl. She looked at the letter. She looked at his face, cold and set, the expression of a man who has decided something and is looking for confirmation, not contradiction. "It is not my hand," she said. "Your Grace, please, send them out. Send everyone out, and I will tell you everything." She saw it, the flicker of hesitation, one moment of it real and brief. Then Loach said quietly from the foot of the stairs, "The silver was in her bag, sir." The Earl's expression closed like a shutter. "Get out of my house," he said. She went out the front door at 9 o'clock at night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the locket in her pocket, because it had been in her dress pocket, and no one had thought to look there. It was raining. It was of course raining. She made it as far as the churchyard wall before her legs stopped cooperating. She sat down on the stone step and stayed there until she was cold enough that sitting still was no longer an option. And then she went to Mrs. Rook's door because there was nowhere else in the county to go. Mrs. Rook opened it, looked at her for 3 full seconds, and stood aside. "Come in," she said. "There's soup." The village did not believe it for a single minute. Mrs. Rook had watched Orla sew for 2 months, and she knew what a woman looked like who was working for honest wages. The blacksmith had walked her home on 8 Friday evenings, and he had an opinion. Mr. Headley had 17 children who could now write a letter and do long division, and he had a good deal to say about the character of the woman who taught them. By noon the next day, there were names on a paper. By 2 o'clock, there were 63 of them, and 7 were crosses because 7 of the signatories couldn't write. The paper went up to the hall. Loach received it at the door. He read it and folded it and put it in his coat, and then he went to his office and stood for a while with his hands flat on the desk. He had 6 days before the Bristol representative arrived to audit the estate books. He rode to the magistrate that same afternoon. Orla was taken from Mrs. Rook's back room at 8 the following morning. The blacksmith stood in the doorway, and it took considerable effort to move him. Mrs. Rook hit a constable with a yard of folded wool. Mr. Headley walked 12 miles to the assizes to swear to her character, and was told by a clerk that a village schoolmaster's word was not evidence. She was put in a stone room at the county jail, and the bolt went across. She had one thing. She had the locket because it had been in her pocket, and Loach hadn't known to look. She turned it over in her hands for a long time. She looked at the face inside, and she said, in her head, to a dead man she had glimpsed once through a carriage window when she was 9 years old, "Well, here we both are." It was Mrs. Tully who broke first. The housekeeper was 58 years old and had been at Greyvale since she was 14. She had known the Earl since he was a boy in short trousers, and she had opinions about what she had watched happen in the past 2 months that she would have carried to her grave. Except she had 44 years of knowing every inch of that house, and she knew that the household silver lived in the sideboard, and she knew that Loach had been in that room on the Sunday afternoon, because she had seen him go in, and she knew that the lock on his office cupboard had never once in 12 years been opened in front of another person. On a Sunday evening, while Loach was at church, Mrs. Tully went into his office with a fire iron and opened the cupboard. She found 2 sets of account books. One she recognized. She'd watched it being signed for a decade. The other was the same, in the same hand, with different numbers. The difference was not small. And at the bottom of the cupboard, under the ledgers, was a bundle of receipts. Received of Standish and Sons, Bristol, on account of the Greyvale estate, the sum of £450, dated March, June, September, December, 12 years, signed S. Loach, steward. Mrs. Tully put everything back except 2 receipts and 1 set of account books. Then she went up the front stairs. She hadn't used the front stairs in 30 years, and walked into the library without knocking. The Earl looked up. "I am going to say something," said Mrs. Tully. "That is not my place to say, and then I will go." He did not speak. She told him. All of it, the cupboard, the 2 sets of books, the receipts, the Sunday afternoon, and where Loach had been. She got to the door. "She never once said a word against you," Mrs. Tully said, without turning around. "Not to Mia, not to Cook, not to those girls in the scullery, who gave her 100 chances to." A pause. "You should ask them. Go down to the village and ask them what she said about you. I'll wait." The library door shut. The Earl sat for a count of perhaps 15 seconds. Then he went down the back stairs 2 at a time and put his boot through the panel of Loach's office door, and what he found in the cupboard confirmed everything Mrs. Tully had said, and then considerably more. 12 years of 2-column arithmetic, 12 years of quarterly payments arriving from Bristol, properly, on time, and 12 years of a man, with a careful hand, entering a different figure in the book that got signed. He sat on the floor of the steward's office, amongst the splinters, and held the receipts. 3 years. The money had come. It had come properly, and on time, into this house, and it had gone into a man's pocket. And while it was going into that pocket, he had stood in his own hall and called a woman a fraud and set a locket on the table like a charity coin. I have never in my life seen 1 shilling of that money. She had said it. He hadn't believed her. He was very quiet for some time. Then he did the only sensible thing left to him. He said nothing to Loach, put the account books and receipts inside his coat, and the following morning stood up in the sessions house and said all of it out loud in front of whoever happened to be present. He said that his steward had robbed the estate for 12 years, and that he had signed everything put in front of him without reading a word of it, and that this was his own fault, and he intended to say so plainly. He said that the woman charged with theft had been living honestly in his house and in the village below it, and had never taken so much as a candle that wasn't hers. He said that the evidence against her had been manufactured by a man who was frightened she had learned too much. He put the receipts on the table and asked for them to be read aloud. The magistrate looked at him over his spectacles. "You understand what this does to your credit, Cressbourne?" "Yes," said the Earl of Cressbourne. "Every creditor you have will hear this by Friday." "Yes." "She may never forgive you regardless." "Yes," said Calder Rentham. "I know. Read them out, sir. She was accused in front of 12 people. She'll be cleared in front of 60 or it's worth nothing." They read all 3 receipts. It took 4 minutes. The charge was dismissed before noon. Loach was taken at Greyvale that same afternoon, packing with £230 sewn into a coat lining. As for where the rest of the 12 years' worth had gone, that came out slowly over the following weeks in pieces. A property in Devon registered to a niece, shares held under a cousin's name, a moneylender in Bristol who remembered him well. It had gone carefully and quietly in all directions, the way a careful man disperses things he does not want found. Every last shilling of it was eventually traced. None of it was ever recovered. Orla came out of the sessions house into cold December light and stood at the top of the steps, and there were about 50 people in the yard, and 11 of them had come up from Cressbourne in Mrs. Rook's borrowed cart, and Mrs. Rook was not crying, but her eyes were very bright. The Earl came out behind her and stopped 6 feet away. He looked thinner. His coat was not well pressed. There was no one standing behind him. "I am not going to ask you for anything," he said. "I want you to know that every word of it has been said in that room and cannot be taken back. There is a room at Mrs. Rook's, paid for, and a solicitor engaged on your behalf, and none of it puts you under any obligation to me of any kind." Orla looked at him. "You went in there," she said, "knowing it would call in every debt you have." "Yes." "Why?" He opened his mouth, and she watched him almost say something prepared, something measured, and then not say it. "Because it was true," he said instead, "and you were owed it." She didn't answer. She couldn't, just then. There was too much in the way. 11 days of stone floor and a hall with 12 servants in it, and a moment in her own room when she had looked at the locket and decided to say nothing, and had been wrong about that too. She was still standing there when a carriage came into the yard. A small, neat, elderly man got out of it. He was perhaps 70, dressed in black, carrying a leather case, and he had the look of someone who had been in 2 counties in 4 days and was not finished yet. He came up the steps and took off his hat. "Forgive me," he said. "I was at Greyvale Hall on Monday and was not admitted. I have since been to Bristol and back." He hesitated. "Am I addressing Miss Orla Standish, daughter of Robert Standish of Bath?" Behind her, very quietly, she heard Calder Rentham go still. "Yes," she said. "My name is Mr. Soane," said the man. "I am the senior partner of Standish & Sons. Madam, we have been looking for you for 4 years, and the will is read tomorrow morning, and I have a coach outside." They traveled through the night to Bristol. She sat in one carriage, and the Earl sat in the other, because he had been summoned separately. Not as a guest, not as her advocate, but as the principal debtor of the Standish estate, required by law to be present. It was on a printed form. She spent 12 hours reading. Not letters from a grandfather she had never properly known. There had not been time for that. But 4 years of her own correspondence, retrieved from a locked drawer in a Bristol office, still in their envelopes. Every letter she had written to Standish & Sons since her father died. Every one had been opened, read, filed, and answered with silence. Not by the house, by one man. She learned this from Mr. Soane, over a cold supper at a coaching inn at midnight, while Calder Rentham sat at the next table, and very carefully did not listen. The counting house of Standish & Sons stood on a street in Bristol's old quarter, 3 stories of dark stone, with a narrow door and a clock above it that kept good time. By 10 o'clock in the morning, there were 14 people around the long table inside. Clerks, 2 solicitors, a physician, and at the far end, a broad-shouldered man of about 55, in a very good coat, who had arrived early and who had already asked twice how long the proceedings were expected to take. His name was Hartfield Standish, Bartholomew's nephew, junior partner, and the man who had been managing the private correspondence for 6 years. He stood when Orla came in. He looked at her, and his face did something complicated that resolved itself into a version of pleasantness. "They found you," he said. "Thank God." "I wrote to you 4 times," said Orla. A pause. "There is a great deal of post." "The 3rd letter asked whether you knew of anyone in Bristol named Standish, who might be related to my mother's family." She sat down. "You had a black-edged card on your hall table when that letter would have arrived. My grandfather had been dead a fortnight." The room had gone very quiet. Hartfield Standish sat down and did not answer, and in a way that was the answer. And Mr. Abel Soane, who had worked in that house for 40 years and had wondered about a number of things for the last 5 of them, made a small note on the page in front of him. The will took 8 minutes to read because Bartholomew Standish had written it himself, in plain English, with no patience for ornament. The whole of his private fortune, £160,000 in the funds, the house in Bristol, and his 3/4 share of Standish & Sons, went to his granddaughter, Orla Ann Standish, only child of his only son Robert, absolutely and without condition. To his nephew Hartfield he left his salary, his quarter share, and a single sentence that the clerk read in a completely flat voice. "To Hartfield I leave the business which he understands, and nothing else, which he will understand also." And then the schedule, 5 pages of it, every note, bond, mortgage, and encumbrance held by Bartholomew Standish in his private capacity. 3 of those 5 pages were Greyvale. 900 acres, the mill, the East Farms, the timber on the North Hill, the hall itself, £74,000 of debt at 4.5%, every penny of it now the lawful property of the woman sitting at the end of the table in a dress that still had 11 days of jail on it. Someone at the table made a small involuntary sound. Calder Rentham stood by the wall with his hat in his hands and did not move. "There is a further document," said Mr. Soane. He had been instructed to read it aloud. It was a letter from a dead man, written in a large, pressing hand, the hand of someone who learned to write late and never quite forgave the effort of it. "My dear girl," it began, "you will not know me well, and you will have been told a number of things about me, and most of them will be true. I am writing this because I am 74 years old, and I have already wasted 11 years being right about your father's choices, and I find I have run out of time to go on being right. I know what house you are in. I know it better than you do, my dear, because I am the one who arranged for you to be there. I bought up Cressbourne's debt before I found you, so that if the man turned out to be the kind of man who ruins women, I could pull every stone out from under him before breakfast. I had the money. I did not have the courage to simply arrive at the door. I told myself I was being careful. I was being a coward, which is a thing I have had occasion to say plainly in these last months. I meant to come in the spring and see for myself. I was ill. I meant to come in the summer. I was ill again. I have been writing to you every month since April. Not to the house, where my letters would have been intercepted, but through Mr. Soane's private address, to be kept until you could be found. If this is being read aloud, then I have not managed to arrive in time, and whatever you have faced in that house is mine to answer for, and not yours, and I am sorrier for it than I can put on paper. As to the Earl of Cressbourne, every note against that estate is now yours. You may call it all in on a morning's notice. I thought a long time about whether to tell you what to do with it. I have decided not to. I spent 50 years adding up what people were worth. I was wrong about the only thing that ever actually mattered, and I am the last man on earth who should be telling a woman how to weigh a man she has actually lived with. You were there. I was not. Do as you think right. Ruin him or keep him. And I will not have a word to say about it from where I am. I would only ask this. Do not be right at somebody for 11 years. I know what that costs. Your grandfather, Bartholomew Standish. The room was very quiet for some time after Mr. Soane set the pages down. Then Orla got up and walked the length of the table and stopped in front of the Earl. "You knew none of this," she said. "No. When you went into the Sessions House yesterday, you knew none of it." "No." "Say the rest of it." He understood what she was asking. He said it in front of 14 people, because that was what things cost now, and he had discovered he could pay. "I believed you had come to my house to take something from it," he said. "I believed it in June, and I believed it in November when I put you out in the rain. I had a steward who told me you were a liar, and I chose to believe him because it was easier than not believing him. There is no part of that I can explain away. That is all of it." Orla nodded slowly. She looked at the 5 pages of schedule on the table. "Mr. Soane," she said, "if I call in the whole of this, what happens to the tenants?" "Their leases come with the land, madam. They would be yours to honor or renegotiate." She looked at Calder Rentham. "I am not forgiving the debt," she said. "Not 1 pound of it. My grandfather bought those notes to protect me, and I am not going to throw away the only thing he ever actually managed to give me. The estate goes into trust. Mr. Soane will draw it. The tenants get their leases in writing, with the repairs listed by name, and those repairs come out of the estate income before anything else. Before the house, before the horses, before the wine cellar. The accounts are opened every quarter to the trust and to me, and you will sit with me while I go through them, and you will learn to read them properly. And if it takes you 3 years, then it takes 3 years." "Yes," said the Earl of Cressbourne. "I haven't finished." Her hands were shaking now, and she let them. "I'm not coming back to Greyvale this month. Or in the spring. I have a house in Bristol I have never seen, and a company I do not yet understand, and 7 months of letters from a grandfather I met once through a carriage window, and I am going to sit down in the middle of all of it and find out who I am when nobody is telling me what I'm worth." She paused. You may write to me. Every month, whether I answer or not. My grandfather had a particular way with letters. You'll find it runs in the blood. The Earl of Cressbourne, who had lost 900 acres, 74,000 pounds, a steward, and his reputation in 3 counties in the space of 11 days, stood in a counting house in Bristol and began, very quietly, to laugh, and then stopped because it had turned into something else on the way. Every month, he said. For how long? Until I write back, said Orla. She held out her hand, not palm up, not palm down, simply open, the way you hold a hand out when you want to see what the other person does with it. He took it. In her other hand, still, was the locket. She set it on the table between them, closed. He wrote every month as he had been told to. The first letter was long, and she did not answer it. By the 5th, he seemed to have understood what the thing actually was, because they stopped being appeals and started being reports. The mill wheel is repaired. It wanted replacing entirely, which the blacksmith said in February, and I chose not to hear. The Marsh family has a dry roof. I have let the East Farms properly, a man named Griggs from the next valley who knows what he's about, and Mr. Headley now has 23 children and has asked me 3 times whether there is any chance of a second classroom before winter. There is. There will be. Mrs. Tully came back. She would not return at the old wages and told me so to my face in the hall, and I have raised them. She says the back chimney has not drawn properly since 1797, and that she has said so to 3 successive earls, and none of us listened. I am listening now. I find I am doing a great deal of listening. He never once asked her to come back, not in 13 letters. She noticed this and thought about it on long evenings in the Bristol house, working through boxes of her grandfather's papers. And she came to understand that he had worked something out, that asking would have made it a favor, and she had had enough of being at the discretion of people who held things she needed. The 13th letter, arriving in December, had no letter in it at all. It was the quarter's accounts, 9 pages of them in his own hand, with the columns set out, and the rents and the repairs and the trust disbursements all entered, and the figures added at the foot of each page. At the bottom of the last page, under the total, he had written, I did these myself. Mr. Soane has not seen them. There are 3 errors that I know of, and I have marked them and have not corrected them, because I want you to see what they are. It has taken me a year to be this bad at it. I thought you should know. Orla read it twice. Then she sent for the carriage. She did not answer the letter in the end. She never did answer one. She simply arrived at Greyvale Hall at 4 o'clock on the 23rd of December with 9 pages of accounts in her hand, and walked into the library and said, without preamble, 2 of these are not errors. You have the Michaelmas rents in the wrong column, but the arithmetic underneath it is sound. And if you tell me you did the arithmetic in your head, I shall not believe you. And the Earl of Cressbourne stood up so fast he knocked the chair back, and that was that. The hall is quieter now than it used to be, and not grand in the way that great houses and stories become grand. The east wing is still shut because it costs £11 a month to heat, and the trust does not permit vanity, and the trustee is not a sentimental woman. But the Mill Lane Bridge is stone now with a proper railing, and there is a second classroom, and every family on 900 acres holds a 30-year lease with the repairs spelled out in plain English. The books are opened on the first Monday of every quarter in the library, with the fire lit. He does them. She checks them. It takes 4 hours and they argue for most of it, and Mrs. Tully has been heard to remark in the servants' hall that she has worked in that house for 46 years and has never once heard laughing come out of the library on accounts day, and she does not know what to make of it, and has decided not to try. Above the fireplace in the great hall, the black and white hall, the one with the long-jawed Rentham men looking down from the walls in their gilded frames. There is now one small addition, a plain oak frame, 4 inches square, with a piece of glass in it. Behind the glass is a tarnished silver locket, and underneath it, on a card in a small, even hand, B. Standish, 1743 to 1820. He started with nothing and left everything where it belonged. Guests always ask about it. It is the only thing in that hall worth less than £100, and it is in the best position in the room. The Earl tells them it was a gift from his wife's grandfather. That is all he says, and it is perfectly true. And Orla has never once corrected him in front of company, though she generally finds something that urgently needs attending to in the next room, which always makes him smile in the particular way that he has entirely stopped trying to hide.